and I have Dio with me and Alexis. Now, for those of Alexis's book was actually recently published October, so a round of applause because her first book. And you've been out doing a few book festivals, Texas, a couple of different places, and it's been so. Congratulations on that. Dio's well, I won't say veteran, but you know, your book was published in 2014, so you're not new to the game. Yes. So before we start, for the benefit of those who might be watching on the live stream and those of you who might not have read their books, I wanted to get a, maybe 15, 20-second overview of what's your book about. What are the key things in your book that you kind of wanted to get across to your readers?
Yes, please. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. Thank you so much, Lamide, for the intro. Thank you so much, Lala, if you're in the room, for the invitation, and for all of you guys for being here so early. So my book is called The Bright Continent, which is kind of a joke, or a play on words at least, because so much of the narrative around the continent is still stuck where the early explorers traveling through the Congo called the Dark Continent. So the book is about narrative correction, and it is also a work to try and explain the ways that challenges in Africa, of which we may be quite familiar, are actually opportunities to innovate. And that resource scarcity and the kind of constraints that you may encounter in day-to-day life on the continent are in fact generative. They can be very productive, and they unleash certain types of creativity that you may not find elsewhere in the world. So the book profiles entrepreneurs and individuals who are creating businesses to address social challenges with a unique African twist.
Alexis?
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. So my book is about ordinary people fighting extremism on the continent. It focuses on 4 extreme situations in Nigeria, northeastern Nigeria, northern Uganda, Somalia, and Mauritania. And it's about telling stories from a different way. It's about the people at the center of these conflicts or societies that are being overturned by terrorist forces, and how people protect their ways of life, protect their families, get through to the other side, and preserve some kind of normalcy. I wanted to tell the stories of the people who have agency, who are not just victims and suffering whatever chaos has been thrown upon their life, but how they manage to resist the status quo in extreme ways, dramatic ways, but also in ordinary, everyday ways, acts of bravery, acts of courage that people on the continent exhibit every day.
So now I would like for us to sort of hear, especially for those again who haven't read the books, wanted to hear from each of you a little piece or a reading from your books. So I think we'll start with Alexis. Yes, so let's start with you.
Sure. So one of my subjects in the book is a man nicknamed Elder. Elder lives in Maiduguri, and he watched his home kind of fall apart around him due to Boko Haram. He felt helpless, but then he decided to do something about it. Boko Haram focused its onslaught on Elder's hometown. Once an ancient center of Islamic teaching and trade, Maiduguri was, by 2013, a city of sandbag bunkers and security checkpoints that disfigured its streets. Soldiers manned the bunkers and checkpoints and stood in the roads, guns cocked, monitoring traffic. Sometimes the soldier wore masks. Most of the time they appeared to be barely wearing any protective gear at all. Sections of the city were reduced to rubble. The attacks were unpredictable and chilling. In June 2011, Boko Haram bombed a beer garden. It also set off bombings at markets and police stations and on crowded stretches of streets. Boko Haram attacked civilians seemingly at random, ripping into their homes, killing their parents, stealing their daughters and sons. It really hurt me, Elder recalled, but we were handicapped. We couldn't do anything. The city with his family. A friend of Elder's, a state assemblyman, visited Elder and his family one day that same year. Elder later learned that his friend had been shot in his house right after leaving Elder's. And to make matters worse, his brother's own son had joined Boko Haram. When the insurgency began in 2009, his nephew was attending the sermons of Muhammad Yusuf, the founder of Boko Haram, and he ran away that year from Maiduguri. Everyone knew he had joined the group. There was no sound logic behind the killings. They killed you if they thought you worked with the government, or sometimes if you worked at all, or if you had your children enrolled in school, or if you were simply trying to live your life and take care of your family. Elder felt helpless. At any point, you could hear gunfire close to your own home. No one was safe. Even if you survived a Boko Haram attack, you then had to make it through the military roundup that followed. After an attack, the insurgents dispersed, often hiding among residents. Soldiers swept through neighborhoods, detaining every boy and man they saw, taking many back to a military base outside of town called Giwa Barracks. The road to the base was long and windy, nearly deserted, through beige sand and dirt and skeletal trees. They even took Elder from his house once in 2011 and beat him. A soldier hit him on the head with a gun so hard he was bleeding. He had to get stitches. Looking back, Elder said he couldn't blame the military for what they did. The people weren't providing the soldiers with information about the insurgents, so what did they expect? They couldn't just hide terrorists and not expect the military to react after so many of their own had been killed. He had forgotten how scared he and his neighbors had been to report on Boko Haram. Either the group could have found out and retaliated against them, or the military could have accused them of being terrorists themselves and taken them. Elder had become used to death, the idea of it, the presence of it, the inevitability of it. It was all around him all the time, a sticky, sour thing that he could touch and smell and feel. It was not supposed to be like this. Everyone was afraid of Boko Haram, but no one wanted to talk about them, much less risk reporting them. So it surprised everyone when, in June 2013, a mild-mannered taxi driver named Lawan Jafar apprehended a Boko Haram member in an area of Maiduguri. With a few other men in tow, Jafar went to the home of a man he believed was involved with the terrorists. They found him in possession of a gun and turned him over to the security forces. News spread of the citizen's arrest. People talked about how Jafar was a hero, a simple man who had done something even the military couldn't do. It was inspiring. Men and some women in other quarters then banded together. Elder considered Jafar a would-be martyr who had truly sacrificed himself and enviably become a leader in the process. He set out to emulate him. His neighborhood was the fourth to join. We knew the Boko Haram members who were living in the neighborhood with us, he said. We just started getting them in the night. We would catch them and then bring them to the authorities. He was the oldest of the group he joined up with back then, a loose association of men who lived near each other. They used sticks and cutlasses to defend themselves. The very first day, they went after 3 young men who they suspected of being militants. The suspects all lived with their parents in the neighborhood. Elder and the 30 other men were organized. They headed on foot to the suspects' houses. At the first house, they didn't find anyone. At the house of the next one, they found all 3 of them together. The relatives of the second man were also there. They watched stunned as Elder and the group crashed into the main room and tied the hands of each man behind his back and then led them outside. They didn't say a word, Elder recalled, because they know the habits of their boys. He told the young men that he knew who they were and what they did with Boko Haram. The suspects were laughing. They had tried to run when Elder and the rest came in, but had nowhere to go. They had known the vigilantes would be coming after them, but seemed to be in a state of disbelief. The men said that they weren't the only Boko Haram members in the area. They started calling out names, people Elder and his group would pursue in the following days. The 3 men then said they had made a mistake joining the insurgents, but Elder barely listened. He didn't care about their regret or remorse. I didn't have any sympathy for them whatsoever, he said. The next morning, the men's parents came to the vigilantes and begged them to release their sons. Elder refused. He said he had turned them over to the military. He hadn't heard news of them since. Now, any place where residents knew Boko Haram members to be living, the new militias gathered together in groups of 10 or 15, piled into a vehicle, and took suspects by force. When people heard what they were doing, hundreds of men and boys joined them, and terrorists began fleeing town. Within a week of forming, the vigilante groups had cleared the city. Found him to the military. It hurt Elder to see him that way. He was Elder's family, his blood. Now what had he become? Elder refused to accept that his nephew could be rehabilitated. His mind was polluted and his actions were unforgivable. His betrayal enraged Elder. We have no regret for anybody if you're a Boko Haram member, he said, because we had suffered a lot at the hands of them. We have lost so many people. He watched the military execute his nephew with satisfaction. Elder's brother had said little at the news that Elder had so swiftly caught his son, turned him into the authorities, and then watched him die. His brother must have been upset, I said. No, upset, Elder said quickly. And his brother's wife? Nobody was upset in the family, because anyone who just brings destruction to the community, we will never stay with him, he said. But his brother refused to talk.
A long decade of armed conflict sent a generation of Africans scuttling between Ghana, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Likewise, in East Africa, part-time Congo and Uganda. Despite waves of conflict in the North Kivu region of the DRC, people see no reason to give up their crops. Until the fighting passes, and eventually it does, they head over the border. Economic interconnections also matter more services to people. And I'm just going to read a quick summary of the things that new and clumsy states have created. The world has watched this story repeat itself throughout the 20th century, even if colonial leftovers
in very different ways. So I wanted to ask you first, Alexis, like, you decided to take the headline religious extremism and you distilled it into personal stories, into individual things, so that perhaps people would look beyond the headline and think about the people who are actually day-to-day affected by these things. How did you decide that that was how you wanted to craft this, and why did you even decide that this was a topic that you wanted to make the focus of your book?
I mean, as a journalist who's been writing on and off about Africa for the past decade, I knew the kind of stories I like to read that I wasn't seeing a lot of. A lot of stories from the continent were very sensationalized, they're very dramatic. There's a tendency to want to focus on the most extreme things that are happening, which I thought, I'm also covering some of those things, but how do we talk about in a way where we're humanizing people at the center of it, where we're portraying people as having agency and talking about their interiority and talking about their interests and concerns and desires, about Africans as three-dimensional people instead of just people who are suffering at the heart of some disaster.
The people I was able to speak with and say, how are they situated with respect to this large global project of African development? And the answer was they were actually very disconnected. That there was a fundamental disconnect between like whatever's happening in Geneva and whatever's happening, you know, in some local town. And that helped identify a few strong voices that could carry the story of innovation and what they differently from what the international community was doing. And hopefully that 30,000 feet and then very close up captures enough of the range of what's happening on the continent in contemporary Africa to be useful to people. Again, in winning arguments, because you're all going to go out and win arguments about Africa after this.
You mentioned something that I actually wanted to touch upon, which is your perspective as Nigerians who have been brought up in the diaspora. I was curious, when you were writing, even though you had lived in Nigeria and you've obviously gone to these other countries and worked and observed these people and talked to them, and you did the same, were there times where you had to check your I'm not really from here privilege, one, and after writing and the reception that you got, was there any pushback? Well, what do you mean? You're not even really from here. What are you saying? That's not really how things are. I wanted to know. So can you start?
Yeah. Well, one, I would say the experience that I had in sort of touring and speaking to audiences about the book, the people who were like front row stands, it was the Africans, right? Because the audience for the book has been extremely global, right? There's like a Japanese translation for businessmen who want to get into Africa. There's, people who are in tech want to hear more about this M-Pesa and mobile money. And then there are people who are more traditional, like per users. They know how to take it apart. They have they're taking the battery out all the time. They're switching SIM cards. It becomes something that is more than what has been marked true for so many different kinds of material goods in Africa, where you need to recycle and reuse and reinvent and take inventory and say, what do I have? What can I do? What can I do without? That is why cell phones are interesting in Africa, right? And so that kind of led me into a whole discussion about the creativity that comes from scarcity and the other sectors to which that spirit can be applied. So that, in truth, is the way things evolved, and how I was like, there's the ingredients of creativity are really here on this continent, and let me try and explain how that works to the outside world.
I also wanted to talk about, in your last chapter, you talked about exit, voice, or loyalty. And I found some common themes, you know, in both of them. When a system doesn't work, you either leave it, you make noise about it. And then the aspect of loyalty was interesting to me, because a lot of times the idea of patriotism and just stick it through it's a theme that used to be more, I guess, strong in the past. Now, not so much. Alexis, in your book, loyalty was displayed for me probably the most strongly with the story of Eunice and Bosco. Eunice was kidnapped and given to Bosco, who was an LRA fighter. And after even escaping the LRA, she decides to stay with Bosco. I want to know how that story, you talk about it a little bit in the book, but how that story was so important for you to tell, you know, even after you went back a few times, you've gone back several times to talk to them, even seeing, you know, their children grow up. Why was it so important to you to talk about that story, which is something that we don't really hear much about?
Yeah, actually, I was talking about this yesterday. I wanted to tell, you know, some of the stories in this book are they have a lot of moral grays, I like to call them. It's not sort of just talking about good or evil. I talk about like what's in between and what the concept they weren't proud of or happy of, and how they managed to get through to the other side. And so this story of this couple who were both kidnapped by the Lord's Resistance Army, and as you said, she was given to him and decided to reunite with him. At first I couldn't understand it. I thought, is this real? This is really happening. They weren't the only couple that went through this situation. But I thought what they were doing was still an important story to tell. It was a story I'd never read before. And, you know, as kind of like you said, in this book, I wanted to talk about the full range of resistance. Not just like the activists who's staging protests, but people who make more quieter acts of defiance. And in this story, it's about a woman who, by choosing to love who she wants to be with and stay married to a man she wants to be with despite the shock of her community, is an act of resistance who she wants, an act of defiance after this rebel tried to take any kind of sense of identity and family and love away from her.
You observed that was really mostly it. And I want to ask,
most of the people that I profiled chose to exit the system, or maybe they were forced to exit the system. And exits can take the form of having a generator, because you are no longer going to be on the power grid that is insufficient. It could mean sending your kids to a religious school, because the state school, it might be free, but you're not about that for your children. It may be that you have security, because you know the police force is not going to take care of you and your family. Or you have weapons at home, or you are worried about your family and you take it into your own hands, as some of the stories Alexis about all of these exits, is they're actually they're focused on the elite, right? Private health care, private school, these are all things that are very, the businesses that I ended up profiling, the model traditional alternative is bad. And so I looked at low-cost private schooling, which is quite common across sub-Saharan Africa. Many parents do not choose to send their children to public schools.
Like we've been hogging, so if you have any questions, please share your hand up so that we can go to, okay, we've got one over here and one, okay, so
3 years, the cost of a solar installation. Every payment comes on time. This company has now seen people paying back their solar purchase and then saying, what else can you sell me? So they've started building televisions and air conditioners and other kinds of products that are compatible with the solar, because people, when given the opportunity, will invest in things that make their lives better. And that seems so obvious, but it is not something that I have seen people assume when they think about the African consumer. And so hopefully together we can help change the narrative both at the level of society and about how we can bring these goods into the market.
Well, our time is up, but I would like to thank Dio, and I'd like to thank you, Alexis, as well. I hope you all enjoyed the session. I wanted to close with something that Dio actually wrote in her book, which I completely applaud. A quote from Chinua Achebe, and you wrote in there, you know, what he said: if you don't like someone's story, write your own. And I think you both did that in wonderful ways. So thank you so much.